Hey guys. Tonight we'll unveil one of the most horrifying executions in royal history, not focusing on the sword stroke, but on the 30 seconds of psychological hell immediately before and after. Imagine a scene where a severed head is detached from the body, yet consciousness still lingers. Eyes blink, lips murmur. That half-minute of terror is a gruesome scientific reality, and it may have been the final experience of Anne Boleyn, the infamous queen stripped of everything by Henry VIII. History books often merely record her execution for treason. But that's just the tip of the iceberg of cruelty. When we look closer at her final days, we uncover a chilling truth. Anne's death was not an act of justice. It was the climax of a skillfully orchestrated humiliation, a process of meticulous psychological destruction so thorough it would impress any modern torturer. This execution serves as a dark reminder that absolute power can turn death into a calculated instrument of mental torment, where the queen suffered an inner anguish sharper than the blade itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England and the second wife of Henry VIII, entered her final chapter, not merely as the closing of a life, but as the crescendo of a meticulously orchestrated psychological torment. On the morning of the 19th of May, 1536, when the painted steel of the French swordsman's blade descended, Anne's head was severed in a single, devastating stroke finely calibrated for efficiency. Yet, for a haunting half-minute thereafter, her body remained a conduit of awareness. Her eyes fluttered in the chill air, as if blinking at the world she was about to leave, and her lips curved as though striving to shape a last unspoken word. In those 30 trembling seconds, life's ember glowed faintly before it was irrevocably snuffed out, revealing the cruel artistry behind Tudor justice. Death, in this realm, was never an end so much as the final act in a spectacle of humiliation. Long before she stood upon the scaffold, Anne had endured 17 days of solitary confinement within the Tower of London, the very fortress where, 3 years prior, she had donned regal robes and awaited her coronation with breathless anticipation. Each passing dawn brought with it fresh uncertainty. The court repeatedly postponed the time of her execution, not out of mercy, but as a calculated instrument of mental agony. She existed in a perpetual state of will they not, her heart hammering against the walls of her ribs as she grappled with the knowledge that, at any moment, the summons could come. This cruel delay was disguised as leniency, though its true purpose was to strip away her resolve, reducing her spirit to fragile fragments. Henry VIII, ever mindful of his image, lauded this delay as an act of royal clemency and further proclaimed his compassion by summoning a French swordsman to perform the beheading. The English axe, coarse and heavy, often required multiple blows to sever the neck, leaving jagged tears and splashes of blood. In contrast, the imported blade offered a swift, immaculate stroke, an illusion of elegance that masked its underlying brutality. This substitution was hailed as considerate innovation, yet it served to underscore Henry's power. Even death was conducted in accordance with his whims, and the message was unmistakable. No corner of Anne's fate existed beyond his sovereignty. Remarkably, amidst this orchestrated terror, witnesses observed Anne demonstrating a disquieting composure. She exchanged wry smiles with her attendants and jested about her imminent headlessness, adopting the moniker unsente, meaning one without a head. Modern psychologists would identify this as dissociation, a defense mechanism in which the mind severs itself from unbearable pain. In her final moments, Anne's levity was both shield and testament to her shattering ordeal. While her laughter offered a fleeting respite from dread, it also reflected a soul fractured by relentless fear and isolation, a woman straddling the boundary between existence and oblivion. Beyond the immediate horror of her execution, Anne's fate extended into a deliberate campaign to erase her from memory. Portraits were consigned to flames, her royal symbols, crowns, scepters, emblems were chiseled from palace walls, and even the utterance of her name became an act of defiance. This posthumous annihilation was a form of violence as profound as the blade itself. By obliterating her image and erasing her accomplishments, The regime sought to write her out of history. When, in the aftermath, her ladies-in-waiting were forced to locate a makeshift wooden chest to house her head and body, no proper coffin having been provided, their tears mingled with the stifling air of the chapel, a final witness to Tudor ruthlessness. Thus, Anne Boleyn's death was not a solitary tragedy, but rather the culmination of a grand design, a drama staged by a king, intent on demonstrating absolute authority. Even in death, she was compelled to play her role: victim, villainous, cautionary tale. The blade that fell upon her neck was but the last stroke in a longer, darker narrative, one in which power wielded public spectacle as a weapon and memory as a battlefield. As her lifeblood pooled beneath the scaffold, Anne's execution served as an indelible testament to the merciless precision of Tudor rule, reminding all who observed that in the theatre of regal might, mercy was merely another instrument of control. Anne Boleyn's final days unfolded not only beneath the shadow of an ever-looming scaffold, but also under the weight of a relentless campaign to tarnish her very name. From the moment the trial concluded, whispers spread through the corridors of power. Allegations of incest with her brother, George Boleyn, and schemes to poison or assassinate King Henry VIII. These lurid rumours, entirely unsupported by credible evidence, should have been dismissed at a glance under any fair judicial system. Yet in Tudor England, where royal authority brooked no challenge, every plea for legal scrutiny was stifled beneath the crown's absolute supremacy. It became plain that Henry's true objective extended far beyond executing his wife. He sought to eradicate Anne's influence, to dismantle her reputation piece by piece, and ultimately to extinguish the hope that her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, might one day claim her mother's legacy. As the sun sank on the eve of her execution, Anne spent the long hours in the Tower of London, her once regal chambers transformed into a prison cell. By 2 o'clock in the morning, she had arisen from a fitful, few hours' attempt at sleep and knelt in fervent prayer. Hour after hour, she communed with her faith, seeking solace while dread gnawed at her heart. Yet even amid the silent chapel's flickering candles, some witnesses later recalled Anne exchanging quiet words with her fellow prisoners, her lips curving into a fragile smile, as if to reassure them, and perhaps herself, that she retained some measure of calm. Modern psychologists might describe such behavior as dissociation, a mental refuge allowing the mind to fragment and distance itself from the unbearable reality closing in. But behind that steely composure lay a soul frayed and strained, caught between devout hope and the knowledge of her impending fate. When dawn finally broke on the 19th of May, 1536, Anne was summoned from her cell. She walked the same narrow hallways that 3 years earlier had echoed with trumpets and cheers for her coronation. Now, the walls stood silent save for the measured tread of guards on the stone floor. Courtiers who once knelt before her in deference now observed with impassive faces, their bows replaced by cold, deliberate indifference. At last, she emerged onto the small platform of Tower Green, barely 3 feet above the ground, a stark contrast to the lofty scaffolds often imagined in plays and paintings. To mount this low dais, Anne climbed a handful of shallow steps, each ascent stripping away a fragment of the dignity she once commanded. Instead of solemn reverence, she faced a sea of jeering onlookers, their chant-like cries mingling with the beat of drums and the clang of horns in a grotesque carnival of mockery. What was meant to be a solemn enforcement of justice had been turned into public entertainment, a warning to any who might dare defy the king's will. In those final, measured steps from the shadowed arches of the tower to the stark, cruel light of the scaffold, Anne endured a painstaking sequence of mental torments. First came the relentless anticipation, 17 days of uncertainty, each morning a question: would this be the day? Then the whispered defamation, incest, adultery, treason. Each rumour struck at the core of her honour, severing bonds forged in love and loyalty. Next, the deprivation of simple dignity. Forced to ascend low steps in plain sight, denied the elevation that would have spared her from the gaze of the crowd. Finally, the cacophony of the mob, a tide of derisive laughter and provocative banners, reduced her execution to a macabre spectacle. One by one, these invisible blades of shame, fear, exhaustion slashed through Anne's resolve. By the time she reached the block, the staircase's echo had done more to dehumanize her than any formal pronouncement of guilt. Where once she had reigned beside the king as his queen, she now stood alone, weighed down not by a crown but by the suffocating machinery of power turned against her. Each breath she drew on that small stage carried the residue of 17 days' worth of dread. Each heartbeat a monument to a spirit that had been both celebrated and condemned. Thus, Anne Boleyn's journey from prisoner to public spectacle was more than a prelude to death. It was the most intimate form of torture the Tudor state could devise. The trial's postponements, the lurid rumours, the low platform, the roaring crowd. Every element was designed not merely to kill her body, but to annihilate her spirit. In the hushed aftermath, when the crowd dispersed and the mob's banners were lowered, history would remember only the severing of a single life. Yet the true horror lay in the constellation of cruelties that turned a queen's final walk into an indelible lesson in the terror of unchecked authority. When at last Anne Boleyn was granted the customary allowance of final words, she spoke in a voice that trembled, yet held its dignity. "Good people, I have come here to die. According to the law I am condemned, and so I will say nothing against it." These words, uttered on the morning of her end, might at first appear to concede guilt. In reality, they were a masterstroke of subtle defiance. Anne neither confessed nor protested, but complied with ritual so transparently that the injustice of her trial could not help but show through. Her composed acceptance was not an appeal to mercy in Tudor England. Mercy was a political tool, but a reminder that tradition alone granted her this last voice, and that she exercised it on her own terms. Perhaps most chilling was the absence of the man who had once claimed her heart. Henry VIII did not attend the execution. Instead, he remained behind the walls of Whitehall, awaiting word so that he might soon after wed Jane Seymour. His decision to stay away spoke louder than any public display of grief. It announced to the court and the subjects of England alike that Anne had been expunged from his affections, from his politics, and, he hoped, from history itself. A queen in life, she died. A woman deprived even of a final glance from the king whose favour had elevated and whose will had destroyed her. The choice to employ a French swordsman, rather than an English executioner wielding a cumbersome axe, further underscored the tragic precision of her downfall. The English axe, with its broad head, often required multiple blows to sever the neck, each strike a jarring reminder of mortality. The imported sword, however, was celebrated as a mark of sophistication. A single gleaming cut, swift and ostensibly cleaner. Yet this elegance belied its cruelty, for the blade's very perfection turned the act of killing into a spectacle of mechanical efficiency. For Anne, it meant one final betrayal. Her life ended at the hand of a stranger, a foreign artisan paid handsomely to perform a deed that no Englishman would touch. Before the blade fell, Anne knelt upright, her eyes blindfolded, rather than resting her head upon a block as was customary in France. This upright posture required unwavering stillness under the weight of the blindfold and the tension of the moment. She could not lower her chin for comfort. She had to remain poised, balancing each heartbeat against the inevitability of the sword's descent. Witnesses later recounted that beneath the cloth, Anne's lips moved in silent prayer, and her eyes flickered behind the veil, as though straining to catch the faintest whisper of the approaching steel. Each rag of time stretched into a lifetime of waiting, transforming those final moments into an unnamed torment, a cruel limbo between life's last breath and the void beyond. Then came the fateful instant. The French sword, honed for that single, ruthless purpose, descended in one motion and severed Anne's head. As flesh fell away, observers were struck by a dreadful continuation of life's echoes, her eyes briefly fluttering, her lips quivering as though attempting to shape a final syllable of prayer. Some claim to see her mouth form the word Jesus, a final invocation carried on a breath already departed. The scene was so profoundly unsettling that more than one spectator fainted, while others turned their faces away, unable to bear witness to the collision of body and spirit. In those fleeting seconds, Anne's severed head remained conscious of its own separation, a visceral testament to the fragile tether between brain and life force. Such moments, often omitted from polite narratives of royal justice, reveal the stark reality behind Tudor theatrics. They remind us that despite the veneer of ceremony, execution was an act of unfathomable violence against the very essence of a person. For Anne Boleyn, whose sharp wit and spirited ambition had once captivated the court, the end came with a single slice that both honoured and desecrated her. She became a living memory echoing through history, not simply as a queen who fell from grace, but as a woman whose final breaths and silent prayers transcended the blade that sought to erase her. When at last the sword's cruel arc fell silent, and Anne Boleyn's head lay separate from her shoulders, the Tudor court betrayed its final contempt by failing even to prepare a proper coffin. Her ladies-in-waiting, hearts pounding and heads reeling, were left to scramble for any crude wooden container to receive her body and severed head. The same hands that once smoothed her regal gowns now trembled as they hurriedly bundled her remains into a makeshift chest, as if she were little more than unwanted inventory. No solemn Christian rites were observed, no incense filled the air, no prayers chanted over her broken form. Instead, Anne was buried hastily in a shallow grave beneath the tower's chapel. The earth cast upon her with the same indifference one might show to a discarded tool. In that moment, a woman who had worn the crown was treated as if she had never been more than a pawn in the king's ruthless game. The campaign to erase Anne did not end with her burial. Royal orders swept through the palace and beyond. All paintings of her were to be burned. Any reliefs or carvings bearing her likeness were chiselled away, and even the mere mention of her name became a perilous act of defiance. Courtiers who dared whisper her memory risked censure or worse for perpetuating her existence in an official narrative that demanded she be expunged. This posthumous violence, an act of historical iconoclasm, sought to scrub her from the collective consciousness as thoroughly as though her life had been a stain rather than a story. But no decree could entirely extinguish the shock etched into the minds of those who witnessed or assisted with her disposal. Accounts from the time describe the ladies who tidied the scaffold's blood-stained boards falling into deep, unrelenting nightmares. Some could not sleep for weeks, haunted by the sight of that severed head and the knowledge that they had placed it among the earth with their own trembling hands. A few even found solace, only in retreating to convent walls, becoming nuns to distance themselves from the horror they had seen. Their collective trauma became an unspoken testament to the breadth of Tudor cruelty, turning the Tower of London into a symbol not only of royal authority, but of the terrifying reach of unchecked power. Within less than 24 hours of Anne's execution, another blow was struck. Her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and stripped of her place in the line of succession. The infant who might have grown to embody her mother's strength was reduced to a child without household, without proper attire, and without the attendance befitting a princess. Her nursery was dismantled, her gowns exchanged for ragged garments. This punishment, exacted so swiftly, revealed that the vengeance of the court extended beyond the fallen queen to the helpless child, ensuring that no vestige of Anne's influence would survive in the royal bloodline. Amid these grim events, the atmosphere around the scaffold had been perverse and carnival-like. Blood darkened the wood, flies swarmed in the warm air, and the din of the crowd rose to a fever-pitch. Trumpets blared, drums beat in time with jeers, and onlookers thrust banners aloft, celebrating the death of the woman who had once been adored. This orchestrated uproar served as a mechanism of psychological warfare, drowning out any final pleas for mercy and seeking to unmoor Anne's spirit with its sheer force. The roar of approval, engineered by planted sympathizers, created a wall of sound intended not only to intimidate the condemned, but to drown any spark of empathy in the witnesses and onlookers. What should have been an enforcement of justice became a public spectacle of humiliation, a grisly festival glorifying the eradication of a queen. Thus, in those hours after her death, Anne Boleyn's memory was subject to the full brutality of Tudor statecraft. Hurried burial without dignity, systematic eradication of her image, the psychological ruin of those who served her, the formal disinheritance of her daughter, and a grotesque public revelry that transformed execution into entertainment. Each of these acts, whether they struck at her remains, her reputation, her bloodline, or the minds of her attendants and spectators, wove together a tapestry of cruelty uniquely tailored to erase her from history. Yet, paradoxically, it is through these very cruelties that Anne's story endures a haunting reminder that the most insidious forms of power may operate not only through steel and decree, but through the deliberate manipulation of memory, emotion, and human dignity. In the wake of Anne Boleyn's execution, the Tudor regime did not simply rest on the gruesome imagery of head and body, separated upon that crude scaffold. It embarked on a far more insidious campaign, a posthumous rewriting of her entire story. Poems that once celebrated her wit and beauty were swiftly reworked into scathing lampoons, recasting her as a lustful tyrant and traitorous seductress. These verses, distributed throughout the kingdom, employed rhyme and rhythm, not to honour her memory, but to cement a narrative of moral depravity. Even court composers were ordered to substitute once laudatory lyrics with biting ridicule, turning songs of courtly admiration into crude derision. The official dispatches that followed further adulterated the record. They lauded Henry VIII's decision to employ a French swordsman, not as a mark of political expediency, but as an act of royal mercy, a gesture of compassion to spare her the brutality of multiple axe blows. Thus, the king's calculated ambition was deftly spun into an image of paternal benevolence, a lesson in how power can recast its own violence as kindness. It was only after decades of scholarship and discovery that the true nature of Anne's trial emerged from the smoke of propaganda. Historians turned to archives long sealed in the Tower's vaults and the royal chancery to find evidence of Thomas Cromwell's central role. As Henry's chief minister, Cromwell had orchestrated a network of false testimonies, coerced confessions, and manipulated documents techniques so eerily similar to modern psychological torture that today's experts might recognize them as information warfare. He isolated Anne from her allies, denied her the counsel of trusted friends, deprived her of sleep by continual inquiries, and fed the court with fabricated rumours. In essence, Tudor political violence relied not on the lash but on the shattering of the mind, a strategy that left an invisible but indelible scar on the psyche of those involved and on the historical record. In a grim prelude to Anne's own beheading, 5 of her alleged co-conspirators, including her brother George Boleyn, were executed in the days leading up to her fall. Their public confessions extracted under threat and duress served as proof of her crimes, a macabre form of collective indictment designed to prepare the populace for the Queen's demise. This orchestrated sequence of executions functioned much like a medieval reality spectacle. Eyewitnesses framed as guests of honour would relay chilling accounts of each confession, each death reinforcing the narrative that Anne's guilt was self-evident. Tudor England's version of trial by television thus became an early prototype of show trials, broadcast or at least recited across the land, its message clear: to oppose the king was to court obliteration. As the years passed, even the physical site of Anne's execution became subject to historical exegesis and embellishment. Some chronicles placed the scaffold at Tower Green, while others hinted at a more clandestine platform within the inner ward. These shifting geographies illustrate a broader effort to obscure the truth, moving the focus away from the blood and the horror toward a sanitized legend. In popular culture, Anne would later appear as a tragic heroine in novels, plays, and films, her story retold with a romantic glow that masked the calculated cruelty she endured. Directors would linger on her final, stoic smile, composers would swell the orchestra at the moment of her fall, and screenwriters would script the crowd's hush as she uttered her last words, carefully omitting the riotous jeers and the swarming flies that accompanied the historical event. Yet, for all its attempts at erasure, the reality of Anne's death remains an enduring testament to the union of physical and psychological violence, of statecraft and propaganda. She was not merely the victim of a single stroke of a sword, but of a comprehensive assault on her personhood, her name, her lineage, her dignity, and her memory. The meticulously staged execution, the endless rewriting of history, and the systematic demolition of her identity serve as a chilling case study in the darker arts of power. More than 4 centuries later, her story still resonates as a warning. When authority wields both sword and narrative, the boundary between justice and vengeance blurs, and the human cost is paid not only in blood, but in the very fabric of truth itself. In remembering Anne Boleyn, we are reminded that fairness and compassion must guard against the temptation to rewrite reality for the sake of power. When at last the blade's arc fell silent, and Anne Boleyn's head lay apart from her shoulders, the Tudor court afforded her no moment's respite. In the first 30 seconds after that final, sharp cut, her severed head is said to have retained faint flickers of consciousness, her eyelids fluttering, her lips trembling as if forming a last, unspoken prayer. Yet official chronicles of the day often excised these haunting details, preserving instead a veneer of noble decorum. For many of the nobles and onlookers, however, The sight of those instinctive twitches proved more than they could bear. Some fainted outright, while others shielded their eyes in abject horror. That half-minute of residual awareness became, for those present, an ominous testament to the fragile boundary between body and soul, a vivid reminder that death's finality might lie but a breath beyond the edge of pain. The ladies in waiting who knelt to gather her remains, once accustomed to adjusting her coronation robes, later confessed to shuddering nightmares, and many left court service altogether, seeking refuge within convent walls to escape the memory of that grisly scene. Meanwhile, Henry VIII wasted no time in pivoting toward political expedients. Within a fortnight of Anne's demise, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, who became his third queen. This swift remarriage underscored the transactional nature of Anne's fate. Once she failed to produce a male heir, her utility evaporated, and she was exchanged for a new consort whose sole purpose was the continuity of the throne. The court celebrated Jane's accession with pomp and circumstance, deliberately overshadowing Anne's tragedy. Triumphal trumpets and orchestral flourishes heralded the new queen's arrival, even as whispers of Anne's crimes were echoed in every hall. Simultaneously, the narrative of royal compassion was propagated. Henry's decision to hire a French swordsman, the man who delivered that single, clean-cut, was extolled as mercy rather than a calculated demonstration of power. Thus, the court's grand announcements reframed political ambition as paternal benevolence, allowing subjects to view the king less as a ruthless despot and more as a magnanimous sovereign. No relic of Anne remained untouched by this purge. Portraits that once graced palace walls were consigned to the flames. Any sculpted relief or carved emblem bearing her likeness was pried from stone and plaster. Coins and seals stamped with her visage were ordered returned to the mint for restriking. This systematic erasure served as a posthumous identity purge, a pronouncement that she no longer existed even in memory. Courtiers who dared to whisper her name were warned that such talk could cost them their offices or their liberty. Beyond the palace gates, church bells across London pealed at the precise hour of her execution, a grim chorus declaring the Tudor dynasty's unchallenged dominion. These tolls resonated through alley and avenue, embedding the king's authority in every echo. Within this relentless function of power, Anne's own psychological defense mechanisms flickered briefly into view. Observers noted her gallows humor in the days before her death. She called herself Unsente, the headless one, and jested with fellow prisoners as though to keep despair at bay. But beneath that brittle exterior lay a mind torn by enforced solitude, relentless accusations, and ceaseless slander. On the eve of the execution, she had called repeatedly for her chaplain, kneeling in prayer with tear-swollen eyes, even as she offered light banter to those around her. Her laughter was no true armor. It was a fragile shell behind which lay an exhaustion so profound that the very notion of sleep had become a stranger. The court's smears of incest, adultery, and treason had chipped away at her psyche day by day, leaving her spirit as vulnerable to shattering as her neck was to the sword. In this final calculus of Tudor vengeance, Anne Boleyn was felled not only by steel, but by a meticulously orchestrated array of emotional assaults. She marched to the scaffold bearing the weight of weeks of fear, rumours, and isolation. Each jeer from the crowd, each pregnant pause in the procession, each resounding bell toll had been calibrated to intensify her dread. Her death was thus a composite act of brutality, a lethal stroke on the block, and an unrelenting campaign of state-sanctioned cruelty that concluded only when her name was all but expunged from every court annal. Yet, paradoxically, it is through the memory of that cruelty, the flutter of eyelids, the twitch of lips, the echo of a jest turned hollow that Anne's legacy endures as a somnolent admonition that absolute power can wield both blade and rumour with equal lethality, and that the truest wound is often the one inflicted upon the mind. When one examines Anne Boleyn's execution with a discerning eye, it becomes clear that it was crafted as a symphony of torment, designed to assault both body and soul in equal measure. The first movement of this grim orchestration was the endless postponement of her sentence. Over 17 long days, each dawn brought fresh hope, only to have it snatched away by another decree delaying the execution hour. For Anne, this relentless deferral was no act of mercy, but a finely tuned psychological weapon. Imagine the mind caught in this liminal space, a fleeting belief in reprieve shattered by yet another summons to the tower's chamber. Each call summoned her from one cramped cell to another, a mental crucible that stripped away her sense of time and security. The court's sentries and confidants who witnessed these proceedings recalled her eyes, once bright with royal assurance, now haunted by perpetual anticipation. That grinding weight, more punishing than any single stroke of the sword, was the prelude to the tragedy yet to unfold. When at last Anne was led to the scaffold, she traversed corridors that only 3 years earlier had glowed with torchlight and celebration for her coronation. Now, the banners and finery had vanished, replaced by torches casting cold, flickering shadows. The footfalls of armoured guards echoed through the gloom instead of the soft shuffle of court ladies' satin. Courtiers who once trembled in her presence now observed with stony indifference, as though their bows and curtsies had been erased from their memories. The scaffold itself was a lowly platform, scarcely more than 3 feet high, a deliberate act to rob Anne of the elevation that might have disguised her fall. With each small step, she was made to descend in both body and spirit. Atop that narrow dais, she faced a jeering crowd whose noise outstripped the pounding of drums, transforming a solemn execution into a grotesque festival. The din of catcalls and drums, combined with the glint of weapons and the swirl of coarse banners, reduced a Queen's End to mere entertainment. In that moment, justice was subsumed by spectacle. Yet Anne's final words, delivered with measured calm, cut through the tumult like a mournful chord. "Good people," she said, "I have come here to die according to the law, and so I will say nothing against it." At first glance, these words appeared to concede guilt. In truth, they were a masterstroke of resistance. Anne acknowledged the grim terms of Tudor law without endorsing its verdict. She declined to don a false confession or to recite the charges of incest and treason. In that single, succinct declaration, she challenged onlookers to question the trial's integrity. If she had truly confessed, would she have remained mute? If the law were truly just, would she not have sought the counsel of her peers? Her silence spoke louder than any forced admission. Notably, Henry VIII did not stand among the courtiers that day. He lingered in Whitehall, content to await the report of her death, so that he might direct his attentions to his next bride, Jane Seymour. His absence was a chilling emblem of his indifference. A king unmoved by the final breath of the woman who once shared his bed and bore his hopes. To Anne, this omission meant more than the loss of affection. It signified the complete erasure of her personhood in his eyes, reinforcing that her value had hinged solely on her ability to produce a son. On a technical level, the employment of a French swordsman rather than an English executioner changed the entire tenor of Anne's fate. The heavy English axe, capable of multiple blunt strikes, was replaced by a razor-sharp blade designed for a single surgical cut. This revolution in violence was heralded as a modern convenience. Less messy, more gentlemanly, yet its efficiency spoke to a darker purpose. The swordsman, trained on animals rather than men, applied a technique perfected through bloodshed. His stroke was swift, brutal, and mercilessly precise. In that moment, the science of execution overshadowed any pretense of compassion. After the head had fallen, the grim ritual continued. Attendants enshrouded the severed crown in plain linen, then hoisted it before the assembled crowd, as proof that justice had been served. Witnesses later recalled the visceral horror of seeing that head, its eyes half closed, its lips twitching in what might have been a final prayer. Flies gathered around the exposed wound, and the head rested momentarily on the makeshift block before being packed away. This display, a public confirmation of her death, was the final flourish in the court's tableau of humiliation. Each step of the proceedings, from the drawn-out delays to the calculated choice of executioner, was choreographed to amplify the tragedy and to underline the monarchy's unassailable authority. Thus did Anne Boleyn's end become not only a violent rupture of flesh, but a carefully plotted crescendo of reckless cruelty. The scaffold's ascent, the roar of the crowd, the hush of her parting words, and the final, cold display of her severed head fused into a single, mournful aria, a testament to the dark harmony that Tudor power could weave when it wielded both sword and showmanship. In that hushed aftermath, only the echo of her courage lingered. A soft lament, rising above the clang of steel and the jeers of the multitude, whispering across the centuries that even in the darkest theatre of authority, a single voice of truth may yet endure. Behind the scenes of Anne Boleyn's execution, the Tudor court swiftly transformed tragedy into an instrument of psychological warfare. As soon as the news of her death was dispatched, the royal propaganda machine went into overdrive, rewriting every surviving account to present the king as a paragon of mercy. Official dispatches lauded Henry VIII for sparing her the barbarity of the axe by employing a single elegant stroke of a French sword. They praised Anne's tranquil courage, depicting her acceptance of death not as capitulation but as a noble act of regal pride. Meanwhile, the very poems that had once extolled her wit, beauty, and intelligence were repurposed into lampoons, reciting lines that branded her a lascivious sorceress and a fiendish traitor. These denunciations were circulated throughout the realm, penned on broadsheets, sung in taverns, and whispered in market squares, all meticulously calibrated to overwrite the memory of Anne as queen and recast her as a pariah in the public mind. In the years that followed, the official histories cemented her guilt in the popular imagination. Charges of incest with her brother George Boleyn and of plotting regicide were proclaimed as incontrovertible fact. Yet modern scholars have uncovered the grim truth. Every shred of evidence was orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's shrewd and ruthless secretary. Cromwell engineered false testimonies, extracted under duress from frightened prisoners, and manipulated court records to support a narrative tailored to the monarchy's needs. His methods, solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, deliberate dissemination of slander, mirrored the techniques of contemporary psychological torture, demonstrating that Tudor justice often meant cruelty by other means. Cromwell's campaign laid bare the machinery of state power. By controlling information and coercing confessions, he guaranteed that Anne's fate served not law but political expediency. In this grand political calculus, Anne Boleyn became a sacrificial pawn in Henry's quest to consolidate authority. She had once been the king's chosen partner, elevated to the highest seat in the land, only to be cast aside when she failed to produce a male heir. The net result was not merely her death, but the complete dismantling of her legacy. Her daughter, Princess Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, was immediately declared illegitimate. Stripped of her title, she was denied the comforts of a proper royal upbringing. Her household dispersed, her gowns exchanged for garments unfit for a princess. In one sweeping decree, the innocent child inherited neither the triumphs nor the patronage of her mother, but the stigma of a supposed traitor. This act of collective punishment underscored the inhumanity of Tudor politics. Loyalty and bloodline meant nothing when measured against the caprices of power. Contrasted with the glamorous portrayals of Anne Boleyn in films and novels where she stands tall in sumptuous gowns, her sharp eyes sparkling with defiance, the reality was one of profound isolation. Court records and personal letters describe her final days spent pacing in dim cells, her laughter, an occasional, brittle reprieve from despair. Witnesses recall her offering a faint, wry smile when urged to maintain composure before the crowd, as if to remind them of her unbroken spirit. Yet beneath that flash of humour lay a heart constricted by dread, her ribs heaving with unquiet sleep and her mind strained by endless betrayals. Viewed in its totality, Anne Boleyn's downfall stands as a classic case study in how a state can weaponize death for political ends, and how the victim can be recast as villain to suit the ruler's narrative. The orchestration of her trial and execution, the systematic defamation that preceded and followed it, and the ruthless eradication of her memory combined to form a blueprint for authoritarian control. The seamless fusion of psychological torment and propagandistic rewrite ensured that her story would serve as a warning. When power wields both sword and pen, it can sever not just life from flesh, but truth from collective memory. In the centuries since, Anne Boleyn's legacy has been reclaimed by historians and artists alike. But the shadow of Tudor ruthlessness persists. Her life and death remind us that the machinery of state can grind down even the most exalted individual, and that narrative, once corrupted, can perpetuate injustice long after the final stroke of the blade. Her story endures as a somnolent caution, lulling us to reflect on the fragile line between justice and cruelty, and on the enduring human cost when those who hold authority decide that history itself must be rewritten. When one delves into modern historical research, it becomes apparent that after Anne Boleyn's execution, the Tudor regime embarked on a systematic recasting of collective memory. Early chronicles placed the scaffold at what would later be called Tower Green, in broad daylight and before a throng of commoners. Yet subsequent accounts, those that found their way into school primers and genteel histories, shifted the site to an inner courtyard, described as a solemn, secluded platform reserved for nobility. This geographic displacement was no mere quibble over cartography, but a deliberate attempt to mask the raw brutality of the event. By relocating the execution behind castle walls, the court limited the number of witnesses to a select few, ensuring that Londoners perceived the death of a queen not as a public spectacle, but as a dignified, almost religious rite. In these sanitized retellings, the French sword that lopped off Anne's head became a symbol of royal justice, its gleaming blade evoking fairness and order. Any mention of her eyes fluttering or her lips quivering in that half-minute of lingering consciousness was expunged, as if to excise reality's unsettled edges and replace them with comfortable myth. This manipulation of space and narrative reveals how power can reconfigure both geography and time to serve its own ends. If the execution had remained a public affair in the city's heart, with cheering crowds and street stalls hawking refreshments, it would have invited widespread empathy. Instead, the official line presented a hushed, reverential atmosphere, a closed-door proceeding, attended only by dignified peers and overseen by sombre clergy. Ordinary citizens, hearing only the polished accounts, assumed Anne had received the decorum due to her station. Few realized the extent to which her demise had been choreographed as a grim pageant, designed to convey the monarchy's unassailable authority, rather than to administer equitable justice. In the days leading up to Anne's own fall, her alleged co-conspirators, most notably her brother George Boleyn, and 4 others, had already been executed under the same spurious charges of adultery and treason. Each man was compelled to deliver a scripted confession, declaring the Queen's guilt in lurid detail before facing the axe. These executions functioned as a Tudor precursor to the modern show trial, a sequence of public spectacles intended to manufacture certainty. By removing these witnesses first, the Crown effectively inoculated public opinion against doubt. The staged confessions extracted through threat and intimidation provided the veneer of corroboration. When Anne herself mounted the scaffold, there could be no question in the minds of many that the state's case was airtight. Yet the grim legacy of those days extended far beyond the parchment of state records. It seeped into the very fabric of popular memory and oral tradition. Some witnesses claimed they developed an aversion to the clang of steel, their breath catching at the echo of metal on wood for years afterward. Others recounted that they could still smell the iron tang of blood long after the platform was dismantled. While princely histories and courtly ballads typically glossed over these sensations, private letters and monastic chronicles preserved them. The involuntary shudder when one heard a distant drum, the sickening recollection of a scream ricocheting off stone walls. These fragments of sensory trauma endured like embers beneath the official narrative, fueling nightmares and shaping personal recollections in ways that rigid tomes could never capture. In our own time, restoring an accurate picture of Anne Boleyn's execution demands a multidisciplinary approach. Archaeologists, working within the Tower precincts, have begun to map out the foundation timbers of earlier scaffolds, cross-referencing them with contemporary sketches and ledger entries. Manuscripts held in the archives of the British Library reveal variations in eyewitness accounts, while letters penned by private citizens and diplomats offer candid reflections untainted by state censorship. These supplementary sources, diaries, letters, even household accounts detailing the purchase of wood for the gallows, allow historians to triangulate the site's true location and reconstruct the sensory environment of that fateful day. Above all, the saga of Anne Boleyn's demise serves as a cautionary tale about the malleability of history. When those in power control the pen, they can recast atrocity as propriety, erase inconvenient truths, and shape public memory to align with their ambitions. By combing through material remains, scrutinizing bureaucratic records, and elevating the voices of contemporary bystanders, we safeguard collective memory against such distortions. In doing so, we honor not only the life and death of Anne Boleyn, but also the principle that history must remain a mirror to reality, rather than a stage for those who would rewrite it to their advantage. From a contemporary psychological perspective, the ordeal surrounding Anne Boleyn's execution exhibits every hallmark of orchestrated mental torture. First came isolation. For more than 17 days, she was walled off from friends, family, and any source of genuine support. Her only company the cold stones of the tower. Next, sleep deprivation. Interrogations and summonses arrived at all hours, dragging her from restless slumber to face accusations anew. Concurrently, a relentless campaign of false rumors, incest, adultery, treason eroded her sense of self. Each whispered slander contorted her reality. The constant postponement of her execution hour kept her trapped in a state of perpetual dread, never knowing when the final summons would come. Her dignity was systematically stripped away. Standing on a low 3-foot scaffolding, cheered by a jeering mob, she was reduced from queen to spectacle. Finally, the public beheading itself functioned as a tool of mass manipulation, sending a clear message. Disobedience would be met with theatrical brutality. Psychologists note that a typical person subjected to such tactics would succumb to despair within days. Yet Anne, endowed with royal bearing and steely resolve, endured these terrors for roughly 3 weeks, an extraordinary testament both to human resilience and to the limits of the human psyche under relentless assault. The behaviours of Henry VIII and his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, amount to what modern experts term political gaslighting. They concocted and reiterated false narratives, forcing Anne to confront fabricated charges as if they were indisputable truths. Although she never genuinely confessed to incest or plotting regicide, the mechanisms of Tudor justice compelled her to stand silent in the face of these allegations. When she offered no admission, the court deemed her stubborn silence equivalent to guilt. Meanwhile, the Tudor propaganda machine guided public opinion to interpret her death as a voluntary acknowledgement of wrongdoing. In essence, Anne was coerced into validating a version of events she knew to be false, and the kingdom's subjects were manipulated into believing she had done so. This represents one of history's earliest and eerily effective examples of how power can weaponize psychological manipulation to control both an individual and an entire populace. Viewed through the lens of show trials in more recent eras, Anne Boleyn's execution bears a stark resemblance to the staged criminal proceedings of the 20th century. In those trials, evidence was fabricated, witnesses were pressured to deliver predetermined testimonies, and verdicts were scripted before the gavel fell. Tudor England, lacking modern courtrooms and media broadcasts, replaced them with the Tower of London, its scaffolding, and the roar of a live audience. The psychological tools remained unchanged: isolation to break one's spirit, anticipation to amplify fear, defamation to taint reputation, and spectacle to enforce compliance. By orchestrating every element from the denial of rest to the public reading of charges, Henry's regime demonstrated that mental torment need not involve physical lashes. It could be as simple as a mind twisted by uncertainty and shame. The most enduring legacy of Anne Boleyn is not her beheading, but her unwitting role as an icon of absolute power's capacity to manipulate truth. Her story reminds us that cruel violence need not be overt to be effective. Controlled narratives, whispered rumors, and orchestrated theatre can achieve the same ends. More than 5 centuries since her death, the interplay between physical brutality, psychological coercion, and political propaganda remains alarmingly relevant. In today's world, where the flow of information can be as tightly controlled as any royal decree, Anne's fate warns us that anyone who holds sway over what is spoken, printed, or performed can shape collective memory and thus wield a sword sharper than any blade. In reflecting on Anne Boleyn's final days and the ruthless strategies deployed against her, we confront a timeless truth. Unchecked authority that dominates both the body and the mind poses the greatest threat to human dignity. Her fall from queen to condemned woman unfolded not through a single moment of violence, but through a meticulously choreographed process of psychological attrition. It is a cautionary tale for all eras, reminding us that to safeguard justice, we must remain vigilant against those who would use both word and deed to rewrite reality itself. When we peel back the layers of official record and popular retelling, a frequently overlooked dimension of Anne Boleyn's execution is the lingering trauma inflicted upon those who bore witness. Beyond the ladies-in-waiting, tasked with laying her head and body to rest, attendants included high-ranking courtiers, legal officials, and even foreign dignitaries summoned to view this grim performance. Many afterward confessed that the memory of her severed head-eyes flickering, lips trembling as though still framing a final prayer, tormented them for years. Sleep became elusive, Nightmares replayed that grotesque tableau until the mind could no longer distinguish between dream and waking horror. According to private letters held in obscure archives, at least one of her attendants sought sanctuary in a convent, choosing religious seclusion over returning to court, lest she be haunted again by those ghastly impressions. What had been proclaimed, a solemn demonstration of royal justice, instead became a psychological scar, indelible and agonizing. In the aftermath, the Tudor state mounted an unrivaled propaganda campaign that would resonate through history as one of the realm's first large-scale information offensives. At the very hour news broke of Anne's death, church bells across London pealed in unison an audible decree of monarchical dominance. Immediately following, proclamations printed on broadside sheets affirmed that justice hath been duly executed, reaffirming the slanderous charges against her. Posters plastered on market stalls declared her downfall not as a miscarriage of love or a tragic error, but as the righteous end of a traitor. Street criers recited speeches extolling the king's wisdom. Balladeers composed new verses celebrating his mercy in commissioning a single-stroke sword over a cumbersome axe. This relentless wave of messaging ensured that any lingering sympathy for Anne was swept away in a tide of scripted fervour. Seen through modern lenses, it stands as England's earliest major demonstration of state propaganda, a blueprint for controlling public opinion long after the sword had fallen silent. Amid this orchestrated chorus of condemnation, Anne's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, then not yet 3 years old, faced the ruin of her inheritance and identity. Declared illegitimate almost at once, she was stripped of her private household, her loyal attendants dispersed, and her regal gowns exchanged for the subdued attire befitting a mere lady-in-waiting. A contemporary monk's letter laments that Elizabeth knew not where to turn, fear gnawing at her small heart. The child was placed under the guardianship of Cromwell's agents, educated not in courtly refinement, but in the grim lessons of obedience and suspicion. Even the portraits of her mother were removed from palace walls, a constant reminder of the stain upon her lineage. For Elizabeth, the price of birthright was a daily confrontation with the state's capacity to sever not only life from body, but legitimacy from blood. On a broader social plane, the spectacle of Anne's execution sowed terror among women who dared to claim influence or step beyond prescribed bounds. Folk tales and cautionary rhymes spread through villages, warning young maids that ambition could lead to ruin. "Beware the headless wife," they sang, "lest the scaffold be your fate." The lurid gossip of incest charges became a whispered scare tactic. Any woman who sought to educate herself, to speak in council, risked the same branding of heretic or adulteress. Across the countryside, yarns were sewn into the fabric of popular culture, reinforcing that power in female hands was both suspect and perilous. Thus, Anne's downfall transcended her personal tragedy, serving as a spectral deterrent to generations of women who might have sought to shape their own destinies. Ultimately, the Tudor media of the day smoothed the rough edges of reality to usher the populace into a single, coherent narrative. Anne Boleyn as a criminal, Princess Elizabeth as unworthy of succession, Henry VIII as a merciful monarch, choosing the sword's precision over the axe's brutality. By calibrating every proclamation, every sermon, every public notice, the court established a template for political messaging that would endure for centuries. The machinery of disinformation, psychological manipulation, and staged ritual that coalesced around Anne's execution set a precedent, one that scholars still unpack as an early incarnation of statecraft's more insidious arts. In the hush after the bells had ceased, London's streets carried the echo of a performance designed not only to end a queen's life, but to shape a nation's memory for generations hence. Several decades after Anne Boleyn's decapitation, scholars began to challenge the official Tudor narrative, drawing on unexpected troves of material that painted a very different picture of her downfall. Among the most illuminating sources were the private journals of the recusant monk Nicholas Sander, letters exchanged by the Duke of Norfolk, and dispatches from foreign ambassadors stationed in London. These documents revealed that Anne's trial and execution were less the result of genuine legal proceedings than the culmination of a meticulously planned political conspiracy engineered by Thomas Cromwell. As Henry VIII's chief minister, Cromwell had constructed an apparatus of surveillance and detention, monopolized the flow of information, and systematically coerced witnesses into delivering false testimonies. Indeed, ledgers preserved in the Royal Exchequer record payments to the French swordsman, and itemized the printing costs for proclamations circulated across the realm. Further proof that Anne's demise was part of a coldly calculated state operation, rather than an isolated act of justice. Archaeological investigations in the Tower Green precincts have added another layer of evidence to this unfolding story. In recent years, excavation teams have unearthed remnants of timber foundations, likely those of the scaffold used in Anne's execution, as well as fragments of Tudor-era brick and mortar. These findings suggest that the actual site of her beheading may have been in a more restricted, inner courtyard rather than the open, ceremonial grounds often described in later histories. Such a revelation underscores the extent to which the spatial memory of Anne's death was manipulated. Officials sought to downplay the public spectacle by relocating it in official accounts, shielding the broader populace from the full horror of what they had witnessed. The discrepancy between physical evidence and sanitized narratives reveals a deliberate attempt to conceal the raw brutality of the event. From a psychological standpoint, the sequence of delayed execution dates, the strategic depletion of Anne's emotional reserves, and the public orchestration of slander align eerily with what modern experts classify as forced psychological operations. Tactics such as prolonged isolation, deliberate sleep interruption, and the strategic release of disinformation are all textbook methods for breaking a person's will without resorting to physical torture. Anne Boleyn's ordeal has thus become a seminal case study for those investigating how authority figures manage crises. Rather than admit to any misjudgment, the Tudor state opted for a public execution staged as a spectacle, followed by an extensive propaganda campaign to bury the unsavory facts. In this light, her beheading emerges as much a theatrical performance of power as it was an act of state-sanctioned violence. Culturally, the figure of Anne Boleyn has endured as a potent symbol of personal freedom, thwarted by both romantic and political intrigue. In the 19th century, romantic poets and novelists reclaimed her story, transforming her into a martyr of love and conscience. Their works draped her in the mantle of a tragic heroine, suffering for her convictions and the vagaries of courtly ambition. In the 20th and 21st centuries, filmmakers and playwrights continued this tradition, portraying Anne not as a scheming opportunist, but as a woman of wit and principle, undone by forces far beyond her control. These cultural reinventions have served to restore her individuality, countering centuries of propaganda that sought to reduce her to a footnote in Tudor history. Anne's lasting legacy offers a profound lesson about the interplay of power and truth. When an individual dares to challenge entrenched authority, they risk being publicly deprogrammed and vilified. Yet her example also testifies to the enduring potency of personal integrity. Those who withstand the pressure to conform, who refuse to own a false guilt, can transcend their immediate fate to resonate in the collective memory of future generations. Her story continues to fuel research in psychology, examining the mechanisms of coercion and resilience, as well as inquiries in legal history and media studies, which explore how narratives are constructed and how they can be dismantled. In recalling Anne Boleyn, we are reminded that no writ of power is immune to scrutiny, and that, ultimately, the steadfast truth has the capacity to outlive even the most elaborate designs of those who wield authority. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a flood of primary source scholarship has cast fresh light on the legal charade that culminated in Anne Boleyn's execution. Surviving records of her trial, hidden for centuries in dusty archives, reveal that Tudor procedure bore little resemblance to the impartial court processes we might recognize today. No independent arbiters oversaw the proceedings. Instead, judges and jurors were drawn almost exclusively from the king's inner circle, men whose loyalty to Henry VIII was unquestioned. The confession transcripts, meticulously drafted by Thomas Cromwell's clerks, bear the unmistakable fingerprints of political editing. Innocuous phrases were pruned, damning details were amplified, and any ambiguity was expunged. In effect, Anne's trial existed less as a forum for establishing truth than as a performance scripted by the highest levels of power. Against this backdrop of procedural dysfunction, the recruitment of the French swordsman takes on added significance. In that era, French mercenary specialists commanded exorbitant fees, and the royal treasury's willingness to underwrite the cost reported in the exchequer's ledgers to have reached sums that rivaled entire shipbuilding contracts, signals that Henry's motivations were as much about ostentation as they were about politics. The king invested in the sword's craftsmanship and the swordsman's training, ensuring that Anne's death would transpire with clinical precision. Furthermore, the printing expenses for the proclamations denouncing her ran into hundreds of pounds, a staggering sum in a period when the average labourer might earn mere pence in a day. Thus did the so-called Tudor £1,000,000 trial unfold, an elaborate, costly spectacle engineered to assert the monarchy's supremacy at any price. Viewed through an anthropological lens, the fate of Anne Boleyn embodies the rigidity of patriarchal power structures that defined Tudor society. Despite her status as queen, her authority evaporated the moment she no longer produced a male heir, revealing that women at any echelon of the social hierarchy were perceived as dangerous when they exercised genuine influence. Her downfall conveyed a stark admonition. Women who dared to step beyond prescribed confines into politics, religion, or courtly council risked being publicly stripped of their honour, their bodies subjected to state violence. This potent message reverberated across the realm, reinforcing the notion that female ambition must remain subdued, lest it provoke swift, merciless reprisal. In popular culture, Anne Boleyn has often been recast as the archetypal brave lady, a figure of romantic sympathy who, though ensnared by love and court intrigue, emerges in modern retellings as a martyr to destiny. 19th-century poets and playwrights immortalized her as a tragic heroine, while 20th and 21st century films, novels, and even pop songs have explored the tension between her regal stature and her ultimate victimhood. In these renditions, Anne is both celebrated for her intelligence and independence, and invoked as a cautionary tale, a reminder that defying social mores can exact a terrible price. Her image graces history blogs and academic seminars, serving as a focal point for discussions about gender, power, and the manipulation of narrative. In the end, the execution of Anne Boleyn transcends its immediate legal and personal dimensions to become what might be called a grand theatre of authority, encompassing politics, economics, social norms, and cultural expression. The trial's farcical legalities, the sumptuous expenditure on a single beheading, the psychological warfare waged through defamation and delay, and the centuries of remoulding her story all coalesce into a potent allegory of how autocratic regimes consolidate power. Half a millennium after her death, Anne's story remains a somnolent but persistent admonition that human dignity can be perilously fragile under the sway of a machine of state, and that the monuments of law and order may, at any time, be harnessed to erase both individuals and truth itself. Finally, when one reflects upon the entire arc of Anne Boleyn's journey from the pinnacle of power as queen to the depths of political victimhood, her story imparts profound lessons for future generations. First is the lesson of power itself. A regime capable of orchestrating such an elaborate campaign of psychological torture, smearing a woman's honor, repeatedly delaying her execution, stripping away her dignity, and staging a violent festival in broad daylight, reveals how human life and identity can be treated as disposable political currency. Once Anne had fulfilled her purpose, she was swiftly cast aside, as though her body and reputation were but tools to be wielded and then discarded when no longer useful. This demonstration of absolute authority underscores that unchecked power, left unchallenged, can turn even the most sanctified institutions' law, religion, ceremony into instruments of merciless control. Second is the lesson of information itself. Anne Boleyn stands as a quintessential example of how censorship, distortion, and historical revisionism serve the interests of the victor. From the manipulated delays of her execution date to the portrayal of a foreign swordsman as a compassionate concession, to the barrage of defamatory ballads echoing through London's streets, every detail was subsumed into a comprehensive propaganda blueprint. In the age before broadcast media, the Tudor state demonstrated that controlling the narrative can be as potent as any sword. For posterity, this demands vigilance in selecting credible sources, in scrutinizing context, and in seeking out primary evidence to guard against being misled by those who would color reality to suit their prerogatives. Thirdly, Anne's ordeal offers a stark warning about the power of psychological torment. Her use of dissociation, a mental refuge allowing her to crack wry jokes about being headless, even as her world collapsed, provided only a temporary buffer against overwhelming fear. Ultimately, it could not shield her from profound anguish. Modern psychologists study her case as an early instance of structural trauma, wrought not by visible wounds but by prolonged uncertainty, social isolation, and relentless defamation. The lasting nightmares of those who witnessed her fate, and the convent-bound lives of her former attendants, attest to the enduring harm of public psychological torture. The mind's wounds, inflicted under the glare of a jeering multitude, can linger far longer than any scar upon the flesh. Beyond these grim teachings, Anne Boleyn's legacy transcends her individual tragedy to become a symbol of the universal yearning for justice, freedom, and historical integrity. Her story reminds us to cherish freedom of expression, to remain ever watchful against abuses of authority, and to uphold the sanctity of truth. Even when a despotic regime sought to erase her from memory, burning her portraits, expunging her name, and recasting her as a cautionary criminal, it was through artful restorations, scholarly inquiry, and spirited debate that her true image was resurrected. Today, plays, novels, academic treatises, and digital archives celebrate her wit, her resolve, and her right to be heard. She endures as one of the strongest voices for equity and human dignity, echoing across centuries. Through the saga of Anne Boleyn, we witness the unbroken thread linking past to present. Whoever controls the flow of information and the guardians of public opinion holds the levers of power. It falls upon each generation to defend truth, to interrogate data, and to preserve an honest collective memory. More than 500 years after her head fell to the sword, Anne Boleyn's echo remains a somnolent yet insistent reminder that human worth is inviolable, that justice must not be sacrificed on the altar of ruthless ambition, and that the flickering light of truth can shine even in the darkest corridors of power.